So our next speakers are Jonathon from Monash University, also an affiliation to RMIT University, and Elizabeth Taylor from RMIT University. I need to also mention that the program doesn't mention that Elizabeth's from RMIT, but she is affiliated to RMIT solely. And their presentation is on a lot of thought, the space of car parks and shopping centres in Australian cities.
I'm Elizabeth Taylor. I'm from the Centre for Urban Research at RMIT.
And I'm Jonathon, Laskovsky. I'm a PhD student at Monash University.
So we're talking today about car parks, specifically talking about car parks at shopping centres, partly because the mall is almost defined by its car park. This picture here is actually of a stadium in the United States, but that sort of wonderful pattern there illustrates the significant footprint that car parking has in cities. And there's a lot more car parking and a lot more to it than you might at first think.
So we're arguing that the relationship between car parks and their urban surroundings appears simple, but that closer inspection reveals a more complex relationship between car use, public policy, and the urban fabric.
So our focus is on shopping centre, the mall, partly, as I said, because it's almost defined by its car park. And we're using Melbourne shopping centres as a case study in that. But we're going to start by talking about why you might take a new perspective on car parking, or at least notice it at all. A few characteristics that parking has. One is that it's essential to cars and to car-based cities. It's ephemeral in the sense that you basically only notice it when you're looking for it. And it disappears from your imagination. And despite all that, it's more or less everywhere. And part of the various forces that came together to create car parking landscapes, including the mall. It includes urban policy, planning policy. So I'm going to be talking about statutory and strategic planning policy and its role in creating shopping centre car parks in Melbourne.
I will then look at the car parks as cultural spaces, examining them through Foucault's concepts of heterotopias and the panopticon. And we read car parking spaces as spaces that link together the seemingly incompatible issues of safety and surveillance, of hostility and convenience. And we conclude by considering the future of car parks, examining the conflict and rage that so often surrounds them. And we look at parking as a resource that's under pressure and ask what the role of the car park might be going forward.
So the first feature of car parking to think about is that it's absolutely essential, at least to cars or to having a city built for cars. I think that figure is actually a little conservative, but cars are on average stationary about 95% of the time. So you have to have convenient parking at origin and destination in order to kind of fulfill that promise of automobility. And even Mad Max, who's sort of half man, half car, has to park somewhere. And that's a bit of context there is Mad Max creator, what's his name? George Miller, was inspired for the film working in a hospital trauma in the 1970s in the peak of road deaths in Australia. So that chart on the right is probably familiar to many of you, the sort of time when Australia's roads really were killing fields. And it's that kind of enthusiasm for the car, but also its danger that shaped films like Mad Max, but also shapes the landscape, and that includes car parking.
So the same promise and peril that inspired Mad Max also underscored the spatial reconfiguration of cities. So Mad Max was shot around Melbourne. You see on the top left there the famous University of Melbourne South Lawn car park, which features in the film. And since the early 20th century, cities have been shaped to integrate cars, including parking, whether that's into existing areas, as in the Italian cathedral on the top right, or taking the place of other uses. And down the bottom there, you see Detroit as a city that's been paved over with car parks.
And another feature of parking, which I mentioned, is really that it's ephemeral. You, generally speaking, only notice it when you're looking for it in a sort of brief sense of frustration, rage, or satisfaction, and then it disappears from your imagination, at least until you start to notice it.
Parking is also everywhere. The ample free parking is understood to be a significant factor in transport choice, and perhaps because of this, car parking occupies substantial portions of the urban landscape.
And that's borne out when you look at aerial photography analysis. These maps have show a breakdown of some American cities or downtowns by the amount of surface parking, and the parking is actually the orange one, which you tend to think would be the black one. And this shows, it varies depending on the kind of history of the city, but somewhere around 20, 30, sometimes even half of the entire area in the city is car parking. And we don't have the same figures available for Australia, but this is an aerial photo of sunshine in the west, and I don't know if you can see it well from the audience, but you get the sense that that same scale of parking, probably 20% at least of the area, is borne out in Australian cities as well. So we're talking about, yes, focusing on the shopping centre car park. So the mall, as it's often called, was created partly through a demand of car users. Its creator was Victor Gruen, who I'm not sure which one of these people he is, but his idea was to actually recreate pedestrianisation of European cities, so to have pedestrians be safe and shopping. It's almost created by a fear of the car, that you would be somewhere without cars, but that was defined by being on the inside of all this car parking space. So, and that's in that little model there. The pedestrians are inside the mall, and this landscape has become, over the course of a few decades, just a common but often forgotten feature of cities, including Australia. We've got there Chadstone, our first proper shopping mall, and also a similar landscape in Hoppers Crossing more recently. And how you create this urban form of the mall surrounded by the seas of car parking, partly through rising car use and the demands of the car shopper, partly through commerce, and also facilitated in large part by urban policy, which is what I'll focus on now. So what I've looked at is, in Melbourne, that landscape there of the car park in the shopping centre. What role did planning policy have in that? And it's kind of surprising how explicit it was, actually, if you look back into the 1950s. So the first implemented strategic plan for Melbourne, the 1954 Melbourne Metropolitan Planning Scheme, and within that, car parking actually has quite a forefront role. It's positioned in two ways. One, the photo on the top left, it reads the formidable problem, ... The other side of that photo, it says, of parking in shopping centres. And the other way it's positioned is trying to remodel along this line here. That's another picture from the scheme, which is captioned Modern American Shopping Centre, which is somewhere near Boston. So what the scheme does in the 1950s was to say that parking is something that's a really significant issue in the city, and it's something that, a problem that other uses have to be reconfigured around. And that's really particularly noticeable around shopping. That's a quote from 1954. Parking spaces should not only be adequate in number, but if they are to properly fulfil their purpose, must also be legally convenient to the shops, because shoppers do not want to carry their purchases a long way to the cars. And a preface to that is talking about changing demands of shoppers, particularly women and housewives and things like that. So it's this idea that if you don't have convenient, usually free parking, then your area is going to go into decline, so you really have to intervene. And as part of doing that, they introduced minimum parking ratios. So that's for all new development, you have to have a certain number of off-street parking spaces provided. Where they got these numbers from, it's not totally explicit, but they do refer to the American standards. So by contemporary American standards, this provision would be inadequate, but it is much in advance of what is available in Melbourne today. So you've got two aspects. One is all new development has to have a very quite ample, but they're saying it's not as good as America's provision for off-street car parking. And at the same time, they're also strategically giving ideas for how to redesign existing areas that were built before cars to integrate more car parking so that they'll be attractive. An example of the latter is Preston, which is a suburban area in the north. And what the 1954 scheme does is give a suggested remodelling of that centre to have more car parking. The top left shows the three-stage plan to remodel Preston. The orange are the suggested parking lots, and that the right pulls those out. It's about 20 25% of the areas to be surface car parking. And then if you look at aerial photography today, that's the oranges highlighted, you can see that that plan's really has been brought to fruition, possibly exceeded in terms of the amount of surface car parking. And this is an endeavour to make the area attractive to shoppers, to be sort of modernised for car parking. The little D, I'm not bagging Preston, it's just a Courtney Barnett song, a local singer, De Preston. Another Courtney Barnett song that seems to relate to cars or fear of cars here. Maybe we should mull over culling cars instead of sharks, and lock them up in parks where we can go and view them. But if we skip forward, this goes into a lot more detail in the paper, but I won't bore you with that now. That strategic and statutory planning framework has changed drastically in the past few decades. One thing that's happened is that I looked at all the strategic plans since the 1950s, and parking, although in the 1950s it's explicitly a focus for urban policy, they're saying we need to have cars, we need to have convenient parking, and we're going to have minimum parking policies. Over the years it kind of disappears. It's something that you just assume it's there. A slight exception to this is from the 2002 strategy Melbourne 2030, where they've put a picture. The top picture says typical car-based centre, and what I find really interesting about it is it's almost exactly the same picture that the 1950s said you want, such as Preston, and all those little boxes are kind of negative things. So it's saying, you know, it's based around the car park, and they're saying the same centre as it should be or could be is this kind of vision where the car park is actually underground, and you've got buildings and trees taking the place of the car park. But at the same time, you had this idea strategically. Planners no longer felt like the urban design, at least of the car park, is desirable, but that same implement that was introduced in the 1950s is still there. So the minimum parking policies, the first ones from the 1950s are shown on the left. We still have that same essential strategy today. So we have a different vision for what a shopping centre should look like, perhaps as in terms of strategic statement, but the minimum parking policies are basically the same. The exception is that now they're a lot more complicated. So that's just the first beginnings of the minimum parking policies for Melbourne, and it goes on. And they're a lot more contested as well, partly because you have this real tension and contradiction between what planners and urban designers say they want and what the statutory instrument says. Whereas in the 1950s, the two were aligned. You wanted parking because you wanted to be convenient to shoppers. So parking sort of become invisible, but yet it's constantly being created by the planning system. And that kind of contradiction between these two goals is often fought out side by side, and that's something I'm particularly interested in. That's just a snapshot of some of the kind of emotions that can be unleashed around car parking in Melbourne, which I might talk a bit about later, but that's an assault, some other kind of very emotional feelings about either the sense of losing or at least having to fight more for this parking space that until now has been really amply provided by the planning system. So our idea is if people can get so upset about it, there's probably a bit more to it, which Jonathon will talk about.
Thanks, Liz. So I'm talking about the space of the car park, and what's interesting is that parking appears to be subordinate to its surrounding area. So after all, there's no need for the car park without the shopping centre. The shopping centre can still exist without the car park, but it does sort of call into question, you know, what that might look like. And we see the kind of the reverse of that in these images of the dead mall in Harvey, Illinois, the Dixie Mall, where you have the shopping centre is long gone, but the car park still remains, just sporadic vegetation. And as the headline says, if there is no parking, what's the point? In Australia, the activity of shopping usually requires the ability to put your goods into the boot of the car and drive it home. So the car park then forms a node in a network of relations of capital, and the space of exchange in the shopping centre mirrors the exchange of cars in the adjoining car park. The utilitarian form of car parking, though, its sort of purely functional aspect, causes it to dissolve from our consciousness. So from a seemingly determined spatial relationship then, the car park unfolds as a complex space, inviting alternative approaches, and this is what we are going to attempt now via Foucault. So the shopping centre can be read as one of Foucault's heterotopic spaces. Foucault says he's interested in heterotopic sites that have the curious property of being in relation with all other sites, but in such a way as to suspect, neutralise, or invent a set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect. And as I've sort of mentioned, the car park mirrors the shopping centre and also our own interaction with it. It brings the car as a vehicle of movement into focus, but limits that movement by forcing it into a receptacle at the end of the journey, the parking space. Foucault says that heterotopias are likewise spaces of order. Their role is to create a space that is other, another real space, as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged, as ours is messy, ill-constructed and jumbled. And in a way, this is the very definition of a car park. Each parking space conforms to regulations from its dimensions, so 13 square metres here in Australia, the number of spaces required, as Liz has touched on, and so on. And even the paint type is regulated. It has to be non-slip, and the use of the space itself is typically legally delimited to the space of parking. So the car park creates a border space that is other to our own messy lives, and this is othered by the disorder and chaotic interaction within the car park. As shoppers, we circle aggressively, cutting each other off, trying to get that closest parking space. And Foucault's fifth principle raises another point. Heterotopias always presuppose a system of opening and closing that both isolates and makes them penetrable. And the shopping centre is nothing if not a space of isolation and penetrability. Its very existence is based on the isolation of shoppers from cars, and yet to function, it must be an open space. People must be able to access it. So the shopping centre car park is not a public space, it's not a private one either. These are open spaces, yet they're based on profit. The vast amount of parking is free or close to being free, and it frames it almost as a necessary public good. But it is on private land. It creates a space that has this sort of tension between, or this concealment of its actual origin. So like the heterotopia, the car park is also a space subject to rituals and rites, from traversing the labyrinthine structure, anxiety about whether you're going to get a space, and the also familiar ritual of returning your parking bags, trying to find your car. So those outside of their cars form part of a behavioural norm. And so there's another area of interest for Foucault within car parks, and that's that of surveillance. So we've touched on it being a layer of security, but Foucault's concept of the panopticon is useful here. So on the left you see the panopticon model, and on the right the car parking structure, and you can see that they clearly mimic each other, with the shopping centre forming the tower in the centre and the car parking spaces forming the cells around it. And aside from the spatial constructs, the safety car park is based on a panopticon of security, including CCTV, a surveillance system that is often observed to be an electronic panopticon. Rachel Armitage conducted a review of the effectiveness of CCTV and found that it was really useful for car parks. It had no effect on violent crime, but on car crime it was particularly effective. So this sense of danger plays through into tropes within our culture. For example, in Umberto Eco's novel, neatly titled Foucault's Pendulum, we see the protagonist being followed through a car park chase scene. They abandons the square, almost running. I'm followed by a car, but maybe it's only looking for a parking place. I trip on a plastic bag, the car parks, it didn't want me. So here the car forms the aggressor, and yet the threat is nullified by the discovery of a free parking space. And this mirrors our interaction with the car park as well. The same drivers who are so keen to cut each other off become placid shoppers once their car is parked. The car parks are transitional spaces then, and drivers eye up returning shoppers because they represent a potential free parking space. But alongside CCTV, these users form another layer of security as well. So any delay in leaving the parking space represents a deviation of feelings, arousing feelings of suspicion and anger. And Blazakova reports of her observations while conducting ethnographic fieldwork that she appeared to be even more suspicious because of her behaviour, that she was not undertaking casual activities associated with car parks, including parking, getting out of the car and so on. She was a stranger that initiated curiosity, connoting a threat of crime. So this element of danger and deviation from behavioural norms links back to the trope of danger within the car park, and is predicated on the negation of a visibility against a homogenising heterotopic space. Car parks then form an intersection of relations, the shopper's relationship with their car, the relationship between their car and journey, and its conclusion, a complex border space.
So, despite often being overlooked, car parks have or continue to form a vital function in car-oriented cities. There is this confluence of commerce and policy and personal experiences. They used to contain cars even as they shape spaces for them. So we don't really have any specific ideas, but the future of the car park. One is to sort of consider again what happens when you start withdrawing the car park from the city. And you can see some of the potential that can be unleashed there. This is the result of introducing a $1.80 per hour parking meter in Yarraville. So we had street protest, vandalism and the public assault of a councillor. Local traders compared the situation to the Arab Spring. And here we have elsewhere the anger and chaos associated with a temporary, I might add, reduction in a shopping centre's parking space was dubbed, quote, Brisbane's answer to Mad Max Fury Road. So if you sort of have to compete more for the space, it's kind of like the latest instalment of Mad Max. In the first Mad Max, it's kind of this desolate, ample car parking, and in the second one, it's this endless chase, the endless chase for car parking of the scarce resource as we kind of increase competition for space or a shift in policy away from providing ample car parking. So one possibility is this kind of battles over space signal the dissolution, the end of this kind of 20th century relationship of the car park. The car park previously contained, you've got the people, the car, the shopper, and there's all this particular arrangement of forces that are coming to an end in various ways.
So one can almost imagine a Mad Max location alongside Bullet Town and Gas Town called Parking Town, where the relics of 20th century planning decisions coalesce together. And the future of parking could be seen as the satirical aspect here, be based around more conflict, perhaps moving parking off planet, or perhaps the shopping mall lot will become redundant through technological changes such as the driverless cars.
And you might add to that, sorry, it's really that really. So we might see more of the Dixie Mall, the internet shopping and so on will make the space redundant. But parking has been long sort of overlooked in policy and our imagination in the 20th century, but it's been very vital. So they also play this kind of collective role in our subconscious. When you recognise all those kind of tropes around Seinfeld jokes about car parking. So even if strategic policy in Melbourne doesn't really, and I might add that the current plan for Melbourne has almost, I think it has it's a couple hundred pages long, it has one mention of car parking, it just says we should have more of it at train stations. If it's not a focus of urban policy, it's safe to say that its presence or its scarcity is going to be a big factor on cities as we move into the 21st century. Thank you. That's it, Preston.
Thank you, Jonathan and Liz. That was fantastic. Really fascinating insight into something that's really central to urban transitions. I mean, personally, seeing the Sydney Road trader, as a former resident and owner of an apartment on Sydney Road, just that sort of mismatch between the perception of what new residents might bring versus the car parking along the street. So, are there any questions? Got a lot.
I'll apologise in advance because mine will be very long-winded, but surely the car park and the shopping mall is a microcosm of society and the urban environment that we now live in. Using examples of High Point and Chadstone, what about all the time stolen within, say, a 5-kilometre area with people trying to get in and get out because of the limited road access? Moving on to that, is this not leading to a cost of inefficiency of the surrounding road network and other things? You mentioned, private land using these things, but then that puts a cost on the rest of society. And then when you get to urban planning and design, if you look at Clyde Road, Point Cook Road and Micklem Road, all major developments going up and still being put into little minor rural roads. Now, surely parking is the solution to our society's problems if we do something about that, because then we can have roads do what they're meant to be doing, which is in effect an efficient way of moving from point A to point B. And should we not be looking at packaging and delivery in other ways and forms? But just as important, it was touched on when you mentioned security. People look upon the car as a form of armour plating. Yet once they get out of the car, that armour plating disappears. So surely if we look at this in total, we can solve a lot of society's problems and not just look at malls as such.
Well, a lot in there. I might just agree with a few points. One, the armour point is kind of what we're trying to get at with Mad Max. You have a defensive use of the car, hence the necessity of the parking space, but then you're frightened when you get out of it. Second point, different ways we can think about parking and the pricing and the externality costs of it. I guess I would put forward as a challenge for all of us and for policymakers in particular. It's part of what my research is about, is how we might better plan for, but better reflect the costs of parking and the benefits as well, and have a more efficient form of distribution rather than just predict and provide. Another point on the high point, as an example, I think it possibly can be read as a microcosm of where society is at when you think about High Point being built on a quarry, sort of an aspect of the industrial past, and a lot of these shopping centres are built on industrial or quarries and other kind of former industrial spaces. So possibly in the future, it's where we're at now, and in the future it will become a redundancy, but we can look at, if you start looking at it, it is a key to a lot of changes. But it's also very, it's hard to change anything about parking for the reasons of those kind of pictures. It's absolute third rail stuff if you mention doing anything to it. You might add something, Jonathan.
No, I think that you're right that the parking is, it does reflect, the greater social norms, and I think Liz is right in that the contestation around it kind of reflects, this change, this rapid technological change that we're going through. Issues like driverless cars, parking efficiency, and better planning. How can we, parking isn't going away necessarily, but how can we use it better and make our own lives better through it?
Okay, we have time for one more question before the next talk. Unfortunately, we can continue the conversations. Obviously, there's a lot of questions that are up for this talk. Maybe over a coffee in the break.
Felding. Does that work?
Just make sure the light's off.
How's that? A brief question. Have you looked at secondary use of car parking in malls, for example, for park and ride on city outskirts and issues like that?
No, would be one answer. I have looked at how you allocate the space and pricing and things like that. So I guess Chermside, the picture of the Westfield Chermside, I think that mall is actually being opened up to commuter shopping, and that's part of the fury surrounding it, is the sense that because the mall wants the commuters to pay but doesn't want the shoppers to pay, and that causes part of this kind of delay is trying to reallocate it. But that's a good question. Another aspect of secondary use is dealt with in the book Rethinking a lot, which has a lot of great examples of, because the parking lot is empty the majority of the time, so particularly a shopping centre parking lot. And so there's a lot of really interesting things that use parking spaces at night if they're allowed to. So there's, you have your farmers markets, I suppose, but other kinds of uses and repurposing in the style of the last presentation as well. So that's an interesting idea to contemplate in future, rather than just having it being dead out of hours.
Yeah, there's one point that I'd make about that, and that sort of links to this idea of security and surveillance. I don't know if you've ever gone to a movie late at night out at High Point or somewhere like that. You're sort of driving around for hours trying to find the bit of the car park that's open so you can park your car and get inside. So I think that those kinds of reuses are really interesting, and it might change the relationship of the car park with the shopping centre, and the spaces themselves may need to be reconfigured to accommodate that.
Could you join me in thanking Elizabeth?